Welcome to the 2 o'clock session on the domestic consequences of globalization. My name is Mark Wu. I'm an assistant professor here at Harvard Law School. And I think many of you know that Harvard Law, over the course of the last half century especially, has played a vital role in shaping the face of globalization, and here in the United States in particular, with regards to trade policy in general. And it's a real pleasure today to welcome back 3 alumni who are truly giants in this field. When I think back at who has played a role in terms of shaping U.S. policy with respect to globalization, it's hard to think of 3 people who would be able to assert that they played a more important role than the 3 people that we have here next to me. You have all of their biographies, and if I actually went through all their accomplishments, it would take much too long. So I'm just going to do some quick introductions.
It would take 3 minutes, but take just 2.
And then what we will do, the way the session will run today, is we will have 3 sessions of approximately 15 minutes or so where I'll toss out a series of questions, and our honored guests will just have a conversation amongst themselves, and then we'll have some time at the end for some questions. But here today on the panel, to my immediate left, to your right, is Congressman Sandy Levin from the class of '57. On the far end of the panel is Robert Zoellick from the class of 1981. And next to him is Michael Froman from the class of '91. And as you've seen here from the slides, right, each one of them has had an outsized role in terms of shaping U.S. policy here in this space. But before we dive into substance, I wanted to invite all of you, since coming back here to campus and to Town Hall, if there's any points of nostalgia or any points now of wisdom that in particular you wanted to impart on our current students.
You go ahead.
No, you're our senior colleague.
No, I'm not. I don't recognize this place, though I've been back a few times, quite a few times. I'll just say something quite personal about my first year. There were then, I think, close to 600 students. Is that still about the number? There were 6 women. Today, that would be totally unacceptable. We were not only graded, but we were given numbers. Believe it or not. When did that end? Did any of you ever have a number of where you stood in the class? Nobody.
Oh, wait, there's a couple.
Your classmates. We were in the same class. I won't ask you what
number. Were you above or below Sander?
I won't ask you what number.
They were given the same number. That was the trick.
We were not given the same. You also.
The question is whether you remember your number still.
The answer, I do more or less. But it was much too competitive when you think back. It was such an onus on where you would end up. And I think that increased the intensity. I have with today joining me is my classmate, Steve Wolfberg. So I remember with a class, and I think I was nervous because already there was a feeling of competition, what number you'd be. And I remember when Professor Kaplan called on me in civil procedure, and I wasn't 100% ready, and he was 100% impatient. And I wish it had been a room like this so we could interact, but there were 4 into 600, 150 of us. So that's a memory I have, and I'm so glad that we're not in that kind of a setting today, and we'll have some real back and forth among the 3 of us who have known each other for a fairly long time, and I think have a sense of mutual respect, not despite our differences, but because there are differences. Today that isn't in fashion, is it? If you have differences, you're supposed to thumb your nose. Instead, we never did that. Anyway, I'm glad you invited me. How many classmates are there? 2 or 3 of us?
Yeah.
Well, welcome back. And happy 60th reunion.
So Mark took us to lunch, and Sandy pointed out the 5th floor where his room was with his brother Carl. We didn't have a chance to go up and see the plaque there, but I'm sure it'll be there by the time that we go back to find out where Sandy's been.
Not after today, anyway.
So just to show you a little bit of the odd networks of life, Mark worked at the U.S. Trade Representative's office when I was there. And to give you a sense of my foresight, he came and talked to me about going to law school. And I said, you know, you already have the job that most people go to law school to study trade law to do, so give it a serious thought. And so he went on to Yale, and at least in my day, you didn't get to become a Harvard professor right after going to Yale. So you can tell my foresight. I was basically saying, oh, you better be careful at that law school, and now he's a professor of high regard at Harvard Law School. Sandy shares something with Mike and I, which is that he would torture us in hearings in public for hour after hour. So it's nice to be with him on kind of an equal platform. And with Mike, we have a shared story, which is Mike was a very influential assistant to the president in the first term of President Obama, where he, frankly, was running trade policy anyway. And I convinced him to take the USTR job. I said, look, this is a great post. It'll give you an opportunity to lead something. I said, this TPP, this Trans-Pacific Partnership, is a great sort of opportunity to make a mark on the international economy in the United States. And I was saying, and I didn't tell him about the part you have to pass it through Congress. But the last contribution I'll make here is that many of you might have seen, and apologize for the false advertising, that Larry Summers was supposed to be with us. But Larry and I have known each other for a very long time, and when Larry learned I was on the panel, he was just afraid to show up.
I should add on Professor Summers' behalf, he had to be out of the country, so he sent his request.
That's what he always uses.
And, the other thing I'll add is we actually did invite an alumnus who is in the President administration, but because the Senate hasn't acted fast enough, we're constrained now with the lineup that we have. But just to show you Harvard Law's reach in this space.
Well, being back in this room brings back memories, not entirely positive. I think it was this room where I took the course from Professor Unger, who I understand is still here, and it was one of the courses I took with my classmate who became President of the United States. I couldn't understand a single thing that Professor Unger said. And he would speak in paragraphs or pages at a time. But luckily, my classmate did understand it and explained it to me later. So being back here just brings back that kind of memory.
Well, thank you, and it's a real pleasure again. Welcome back. What I'm going to do is sort of set the stage for those of you who may not follow trade policy as closely. I know everyone follows trade policy, right? But who may not follow trade policy quite as closely. And I think the last election really highlighted the divisions in this country with regards to views on globalization, trade policy, and so forth. But in some ways, trade and globalization has worked exactly as advertised, right? U.S. exports have grown very rapidly over the course of the last 2 decades. Trade is oftentimes discussed not just as an economic tool, but as a security tool, and certainly trade has helped to strengthen or fortify the Western alliance in the days of the Cold War. But even today, trade continues to draw in a number of major U.S. allies, and those in light gray are additional countries in the Asia-Pacific that were involved in the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And when we think about this, and we have a tendency these days to think only in terms of our own country, but if you think about trade as a classic win-win proposition, right, you see that this has played itself out as advertised as well. Global inequality is falling, and this is what we in academia refer to as the elephant curve from Branko Milanovic at NYU. But this basically shows global income across ventiles at the bottom there, and the change in global income for each one of these ventiles. And you'll see, right, for those basically between the bottom 10th percentile all the way through the 65th percentile, they've benefited immensely from globalization. But what I've highlighted here is, in circle there, is that there is a flip side to this debate. And that circle there, or where you see point number 2, right? Point number 1 is, right, the growing middle class in emerging economies. Point number 3 refers to the global elites who've all done quite well. But point number 2 here are those who, from a global income scale, are between, right, the 75th percentile and the 85th, 90th percentile. But these are oftentimes the workers in the advanced economies. And you'll see that their growth has not quite been as advertised. And when you disaggregate the data a little bit further, you see this is not just a story here in the United States, but 80% of American households have seen their income either flat or falling over the course of the last decade. And what I wanted to point out here is oftentimes we think this is just as simple as basically expanding social safety nets or redistributing income. So this last chart here is broken out across quintiles here. You see, right, basically the top 20% here benefiting the United States. The story used to be, right, not quite as dramatic, but it's increased a little bit more, right, in terms of the last decade or so. But these trends have basically continued. And we might say, well, this is a particularly American story. But if you look at Western Europe, where they're considered generally have better social safety nets, this is the same graph for the Netherlands. And if you say, well, perhaps, right, if this redistribution story were different, maybe we would have a different type of reaction towards trade and globalization. Well, let me show you one country in Europe that has done a lot better in terms of redistributing income or having income rise for the bottom quintile and for this, right, those in the 20th to 40th percentile. And that country would be, you might not guess it, but the United Kingdom, right, which is now facing the same types of backlash here on trade and globalization. So my first question, just to get us started, is why, in your view, do you think there has been this growing populist backlash against trade and globalization? And looking back over the course of the last 25 years or so, what happened that you did not expect or that you think the experts failed to predict? And to what extent is the challenge today really one of a failure to anticipate or ameliorate these shifts in global technology and automation, as opposed to ones that were really triggered by trade policy and globalization? And to what extent has leadership, agency, and the lack thereof really mattered as we look back at what's happened over the last 25 years or so?
Who wants to start? Bob, why don't you do that?
No, you're the elected official.
That way we can correct you after you're done.
That's what I was afraid of. It's like being at a class at Harvard Law School. You know, we thought the big trade debate was going to be over the WTO and the Doha round, right? I was there at its start. It was right after 9/11. And it did not happen. And the next was TPP that Mike Froman was so instrumental in. And that has not happened. And so the big debate over trade wasn't that yet. And so now it's come to NAFTA. Unexpectedly, the big trade debate is over what's going to happen with NAFTA. And I think what has happened is very much related to your question, because it goes back 25 years. And the big issue in NAFTA, the thing that divided people most of all, was over whether there should be labor and environmental standards enforceable in NAFTA. And the Democratic Party was very split, and a lot of us, because of the failure to have enforceable labor standards, environmental standards, voted against it. We had been down to the border, many of us, saw the maquiladoras. In those days, Mexico's industrial development was essentially along the border. Most of the companies would not let us into their plants, so we could not talk to the workers inside the plant. They were making, when we talked to them outside the plant, about $1.25 an hour. And that was 25 years ago. What happened was even more than I think was predicted. Essentially, there was, you can call it a flight, if not a flight, a major movement, especially of industry, from the United States to Mexico. And that's been especially impactful in the Middle West, especially so in the automotive industry, but considerably beyond the automotive industry. And so people began to say, what about my job? And why are we losing jobs to a place that is making, where workers are making $1.25 an hour? And while, according to the only data we really have, while productivity in the industrial sector in Mexico, as the plants moved away from the border, while the productivity went up 80%, the wages of Mexican workers actually went down 20%. And so that really is the kind of the juice in the reaction. And I don't think there's time right now, I hope we'll get into it, as to what we do about it. But really, NAFTA was the first occasion where the U.S. entered into a major trade agreement bilaterally, in this case it was trilaterally, with a country that had a very, very different economic structure. It was the first time. And our concern was, when you try to do that, if you don't pay attention to the factors of competition, including labor costs, that it was going to have a major impact on jobs in the United States. And that's really, it happened to a considerable extent. One can argue how many jobs were lost, and one of the professors at MIT says, not nearly as great as China. But I just close with this. In the last campaign, if you name the 5 top issues, I think one of them was trade. And if you ask people to name what it is about trade, they would say China. They would say maybe currency. They would say Mexico. And they would say terrible wages. And when the president-elect went to Carrier in Indiana, if you ask people, as we have, what incidents you remember from the campaign, it's interesting how the name Carrier is often one of the 10 incidents that people mention. So we'll start with that, okay?
I'd like to maybe broaden it out a bit, because I think it goes way beyond NAFTA, and it really is what it means to live in a rapidly changing economy. Most legitimate economists will tell you that 80% of the impact on jobs and wages in the United States comes from technology. And we know that to be true, because right now we're manufacturing more product in the United States than we ever have in our history. For those people who say we don't make things here anymore, they're completely wrong. We produce more manufactured product than ever before. We produce more cars in the United States than ever before. But we're doing so with many fewer workers. And that's the result largely of automation and technology that's been introduced there. globalization does play a role. Globalization, there's no doubt that globalization plays a role in creating wage competition and suppressing wages and in the nature of work. But I would distinguish, it's important not to conflate globalization and trade agreements. Globalization is a fact of life. It's the reflection of the containerization of shipping, the spread of broadband, the inclusion of countries from Eastern Europe to China into the global system. Trade agreements are how you shape globalization, by raising standards in other countries, by making sure, as Sandy said, that they do play by fair rules, or that you do affect the structure of their economy in a way that levels the playing field between the United States and its workers and its businesses and workers and businesses abroad. So I think it's important not to conflate those two. You know, it's interesting. Sandy's absolutely right. Trade has played a very significant role in the last election. But President Trump has managed to do something that neither President Obama nor President Bush nor President Clinton was able to do, and that is get the level of support of Democrats for NAFTA up to 71%. Support among Democrats for NAFTA has gone from 48% to 71% since 2008. Support for NAFTA among Republicans has declined by about 9 points. And that's, I think, what we really saw in the last election, is that the bedrock of support for open trade, which largely came from the Republican Party with a critical mass of Democrats along the way, that has begun to fray as President Trump tapped into a very important populist vein. I think it's important to recognize that the things that populist vein represents are totally legitimate. The concerns about wage stagnation, the concerns about widening income inequality. And I think it reflects a failure of both parties, to be frank, of taking those issues seriously over the years and doing the things we need to do to prepare people for what they need to do to succeed in a rapidly changing economy, and helping individuals and communities when they're adversely affected by change, whether that change comes from technology or immigration or globalization. I'm amazed that right now, after this election, there's been almost zero discussion in Congress about what do we do for those people who feel left behind, and that neither party has actually put together a very comprehensive or compelling policy program accordingly.
So let me compliment what Sandy and Mike have said by starting out with a little context here, because I think, Mark, it's relevant to your larger charge. In 1945, the United States represented about 50% of world output. That dropped quite quickly as countries started to recover to about 27.5% by 1950. By the early 70s, it was about 22, 23%. Today, it's about 17 or 18%. So it's inevitable. As the world prospers, you're going to get more competition. And as Sandy certainly encountered in Michigan, you had other events. People in this room will have different time spans, but in the 70s, the oil crisis really hit the auto companies hard, in part because they weren't building the right cars. In the 80s, the dollar was very, very strong in the first half, and that had a real set of pressure on manufacturing. I think in this most recent period, we've had, by historical terms, a relatively slow recovery. This is not blaming anybody. This tends to happen after a financial crisis. But that's sort of the context for, I think, this debate. The second is change scares people. As Mike said, most economists will point out that this is driven as much by technology or more than it is trade. But the reality is, if you're in the world of policy, you have to deal with those fears, and you have to figure out kind of how you're going to try to address people's concerns. Again, some context. In 1900, the United States had about 40% of its people involved with agriculture. So now we have about 1%, and we're far more productive. Today, the manufacturing percentage has gone down. Services now represent about 80%. But, as Mike mentioned, the manufacturing share has continued, the value has increased, and as a global competitive factor, it's remained about 20% for about 40 years. Varies a little bit with exchange rates. Now, third, and again, this is not a point that I've ever heard Sandy say, but I do believe some people in the debate sort of engage with this. When you get scared and you're from a big country, it's easy to blame foreigners. It's easy to say they're the source of all my problem, as opposed to maybe the auto industry needs to clean up its act and people need to adjust to the different types of competition. Again, this is not new. There was a party called the Know-Nothings in the 19th century, and the name came from the fact when they were asked why they opposed different outsider groups, whether Catholics or foreigners, that I know nothing, was their answer, okay? This happened in the market crash after 1929, the Smoot-Hawley tariff, where we increased tariffs on average 60%. There was retaliation. Our imports fell 2/3. Our exports fell 2/3. Oh, we had a trade surplus. 25% unemployment, too. Okay? So the critical question, I think, is how you help people manage change. And I know that's sort of one of the issues that we're going to get to. Fourth point. We were talking about this a little bit after at lunch. You know, people will be sifting through this for a long time. But I'm not convinced that trade was the dominant factor in some of the political shifts we saw in the last election. What you could see in the United States in particular was a lot of the districts that had big surges of immigration created an anxiety level about change, sense of identity. And Mark touched on a point, but I want to underscore it. Okay, look at Britain, where you had large immigration, but by the way, quite pro-trade. Germany, where you had large influx, quite pro-trade. Australia and Sweden are good examples. And look at all those cases had the types of populist politics that we're talking about here. Now, these things get interrelated. You know, if you don't have a job, then obviously you get more fearful. But I do think it's important, whether politically or economically, you try to analyze the issue in a careful way. And I think the real question that led to big switches was this sense that the world is getting worse for people like me, a fear of loss of national identity. All of a sudden, half the kids in the school don't speak English, and you don't send your kids to private school. You have to deal with a very different sort of changed environment. And you saw this across Europe and the United States. Interestingly, and a point that Mike touched on, the polling on trade has actually improved since President Trump. The Chicago Council on Foreign Global Affairs reported that 72% of the people think trade is good for the economy, 78% think it's good for consumers, 57% say jobs. Now, as Sandy knows, there's an intensity issue here. Okay, that's what people might feel in general points, but if you lose your job or if there's a sort of a factor that affects your community and you see it, then you're going to react in a different way. And part of the challenge of trade policy, of course, is how do you get people to recognize the benefits? So I could never get the Boeing aerospace workers to support trade, even though 90% of their product gets sold abroad. Mike and I were comparing notes. We could never get the congresswomen from Silicon Valley to support trade, even though you think they're kind of part of an international economy. My guess is now that they're realizing they're in an international economy because they're starting to get clobbered, they may all of a sudden have a different interest in trade. But this is kind of the reality of politics on the ground. At the end of the day, I do really think we have to do a much better job about how you help people adapt to change. But I also think it's partly sort of making the case. And here, this is the one issue that I'll diverge a little bit from Mike, but it's not directly with him. At least I was told by some of his colleagues that because NAFTA polled poorly, President Obama said, let's not use the term NAFTA, okay? Because it's just a loser. We'll make the argument in some other way. Well, most of us went to law school. If one guy only makes the side of the case, the chance for the other side of the case is not going to be very good. Having said that, the most recent data that I showed is the number of people that want to leave NAFTA is about 14%. Okay? Sandy mentioned the effects of NAFTA. Keep in mind, the auto companies like NAFTA because we need to see North America as part of a global system. And the only way that we're going to be able to compete in a global auto industry is to be able to have the unification of this market where piece parts are crossing about 14 different times in the process. And then, frankly, in the 90s, after NAFTA was passed in the Clinton administration, unemployment went to 4.1, 3.9.
22 million new jobs.
Wages went up, manufacturing went up. So if NAFTA was so bad, how'd that happen?
All right, so let me just let me comment because I wrote down your comments, and this is a really useful discussion, and I wish we could have it in a very broad sense. We haven't really had an intelligent discussion. It isn't about, I want to just run through these quickly, about whether there are benefits to trade, clearly. And I got into terrible trouble supporting China PNTR after we proposed some bipartisan amendments. But I want to just go through this very quickly. Fear. There is fear. There's also reality. And the reality is that in recent times, the wages for the middle class in this country, the wages have been stagnant. I'll be the first coming from Macomb County, or representing it, the original Reagan Democratic place, Macomb County, that there is an identity, or whatever you want to call it, cultural element to last year. But there also was an economic reality to it. And for us not to recognize that is a mistake. How to manage it, we'll get to that later. But you can't tell people, we're going to help you when you lose your job, which we need to do, without being concerned about people losing their jobs in the first place, because you'll never connect. In terms of automation, clearly here to stay, but you can't argue that the movement of the auto companies and the auto parts companies to Mexico was because of automation. It wasn't. It was because of cheap labor, and we'll talk about this later, because of Mexico's industrial structure that essentially keeps wages at $1.50 an hour. BMW just opened a plant making fancy cars in Mexico. They have a contract, they say, with a union, which is part of the Mexican government. It's affiliated. They signed a contract like the thousands of others in Mexico where there were no employees or very few, and the starting wage there is $1.25 an hour. In terms of popular opinion, I just saw a survey, and it's really interesting. When you ask people about NAFTA, it's true. More Democrats are positive than before, and fewer Republicans are. But then you say, what do you think about our companies competing with production in Mexico, where wages are 1/5 or 1/8 that they are in the U.S.? Overwhelmingly, Democrats say that has to change. Overwhelmingly. And that's the basic issue in Mexico. With Mexico, if you ask what's the most controversial issue, and we'll get to it in NAFTA, there are other issues like dispute settlement, etc. But the major issue goes back to 25 years ago in the fight over whether there were going to be enforceable labor and environmental standards in NAFTA. And I just want to finish about the auto companies. Look, I mean, and Mike knows this and Bob knows this. Some of us were in the center of trying to save the American auto industry. And under the president, we succeeded. And so it's, in a sense, not so easy for me because the big three have moved plants down to Mexico. The Japanese companies have moved plants to Mexico. The German companies have moved plants to Mexico. The American auto parts companies, they won't give us the data, but from what I know, 2 or 3 of them, the large ones, which had 80, 90,000 employees in the United States 10 years ago, now have 10,000. And the vast majority of their employees are in Mexico, making $1.50 or $2. And they went there because of that. And so I just want to urge all of us who care about trade, who all of us understand globalization and want the expansion of trade, need to understand that if we don't face the realities and try to shape how it occurs, we're going to undermine support for trade. And the last thing I'll say is we're also going to give an opening to demagogues.
So just to respond, and you've seen a good example here. I think, while Sandy and I don't agree on many trade topics, he's always been one of the most thoughtful people trying to dig into it, understand it. And the point that he started out with is the critical point, which is when somebody loses their job, and as an elected politician, you have this closer, Mike and I had to deal with this in different ways. It's a damn hard thing to explain to people because what they're concerned about is their livelihood, their family. The question, however, is, okay, how do we really help that person? So if you want to increase their wages, people who work in trade, by average, have about 18% higher wages because they're more productive. They're more sort of competitive as they go forward. In terms of Mexico, okay, I don't think it's such a bad idea that Mexico grows, that wages do increase over time. By the way, they buy a lot from the United States, and the nature of the world economy that we live in is one where you're going to have supply and logistics chains that cross countries, and the question is, how effective are you going to be to keeping those jobs? So for German companies, I don't see BMW pulling out of South Carolina, but if they lose access to parts from Mexico, they may very well move out of South Carolina. Third, and again, this is different from Sandy than others, the unions in the United States, I think, made a fundamental decision in the 70s and 80s, which is they were going to blame these problems on trade. And here's my test case. We negotiated a free trade agreement with Australia, 2003 and 2004. Australia has much higher collective bargaining procedures than the United States has. It's agreed to all 8 ILO labor standards, which the United States has not. It has national health insurance. Its environmental issues are surely at the U.S. level. Could the AFL-CIO support that? No. So what I want to distinguish is, look, there's some people that are just going to oppose trade. They're just protectionists. There's Republicans, there's Democrats. We've seen it in our history. Sandy has an argument on what he would like to try to do and change. Some of his ideas I might agree with, some might not. And to compliment Sandy on this, he mentioned the NAFTA, and he was one of the people that pushed for core ILO labor and environmental standards. I was in the Bush 41 administration when NAFTA was negotiated. And frankly, my sense was to get that passed, we'd have to do something on environment and labor. And I quietly did some side agreements, which the Clinton administration picked up and used. Sandy's right, they're not formally in the agreement, and I think formally they should be in the agreement.
They're totally unenforceable.
Well, and I think they should be in the agreement, so I'm taking your point. But the question also is, do you really think Washington is good at setting wage rates for other countries? I don't really believe the United States government is very good at setting prices. Wage and price control didn't work too well in the Nixon administration. So what should be the average wage in Mexico? $2 an hour? $5 an hour? $10 an hour? Is that something that we should set? And, you know, this is where, again, some sensitivity to the other country involved. Mexicans don't want their people to be poor. They want to improve the economy. One of the real tragedies about the debate of NAFTA now is after 25 or 30 years, we have 3 democracies sort of engaging in each other, better demographics, better possibility to compete globally. We may be turning Mexico in the other direction. You've got a man named Lopez Obrador who wants to go back to the old sort of Mexican model, and our position on NAFTA on this government is just sort of playing into the hands of it. So I take Sandy's point, but where he and I will differ, and it's a fair debate, but I think some engage in a more demagogic way, is I don't like to mislead people. I don't like to lie to people just to make them feel like there's some empathy, okay? Raising America's trade barriers are not going to help those people, okay? By the way, we never talk about imports. Keep in mind, about 60% of the products coming into the United States are for intermediate goods, commodities, sort of capital goods. On average, the average family in America saves about $10,000 a year from all the reductions of costs for different trade agreements. If you don't believe me, go out and look in the parking lot. Are there any foreign cars? Do people want to buy foreign cars? Should we stop them? Should we stop them from buying fruits and vegetables? So, yes, we have to help people adjust, and frankly, I think the greatest effect is going to be more technological. But let's not do it by trying to wall America off from the world. It won't work.
I think Sandy lays out some very important points, and that's why over the course of the past 25 years, and Sandy negotiated a very important set of agreements in 2007 with the Bush administration about how labor and environment should be dealt with in trade agreements. But now we take labor and environment as seriously as we take any other issue. And so wouldn't it be great to have an agreement where Mexico is required to allow for independent unions and collective bargaining and prohibited forced labor and child labor and required minimum wage laws and hours regulation and workplace regulations, and where they got rid of some of the things that Sandy referred to, called protection contracts, and where they restructured their whole labor justice system, something called the conciliation arbitration boards. Wouldn't that be great to have an agreement like that? Wouldn't that help level the playing field for American workers? Well, that's what TPP was, and Sandy opposed it. So the question is, why are we, we did these things. We worked, as Bob said, to try and raise standards in these other countries. That's why standing back from these things and putting them on the shelf is so dangerous, because now we don't have that hook with Mexico. That's why BMW can go sign a protection contract, because we don't have the ability to impose trade sanctions on Mexico the way we negotiated it in TPP. And by the way, it's not just Mexico, but very importantly, Vietnam, another low-wage country with whom we compete. If you look at the TPP agreement, 5,300 pages, much maligned because of how long it is. Read 12 pages called the Vietnam Labor Consistency Plan. It's a remarkable document where the first communist country we've ever negotiated with, one-party state, one labor union labor market, has agreed to allow independent unions that can elect their own officials, raise their own finances, affiliate with who they want to, strike, engage in collective bargaining, and if they don't do it, they don't get access to our market. Our market access was contingent on them making these reforms. That's now sitting on the shelf. And I hope at some point that people will take it off the shelf and realize that if we do really care about American workers, we really do care about leveling the playing field, we shouldn't make the perfect the enemy of the good, but we should take these kinds of reforms and actually be able to enforce them, including through trade sanctions.
So let me take this opening and invite.
Let me just say 1 minute.
Sure.
Okay, because I don't want to renegotiate, to talk about TPP in great detail here. You do. but let me just say, it isn't setting wage rates, Bob. It's giving people their basic rights as workers and as human beings. We're not talking about setting wage rates. The May 10th agreement that Charlie Rango and I put together, really, the Bush administration reluctantly accepted it, said put the basic ILO, International Labor Standards, and the environmental standards enforceably into trade agreements. It's not setting wages.
No, I agree with that.
Okay,
but
so don't call.
But it's in TPP.
And
And-
Korea
okay,
and
I'll
Colombia
get to that.
and
I'll
Panama.
get to that.
And you just to be fair, in your presentation, you did focus on Mexican wage rates. And this may be, I don't know, you are alleged to have the view in NAFTA that you believe that
Some
we
of your
should
public comments.
require certain wage rates in Mexico.
But that's by people who are totally misinformed and are using essentially arguments that have no validity. We fought the CAFTA agreement you were part of, and so this gets interesting. The main reason was because there was not placed in the Central America Free Trade Agreement basic enforceable labor and environmental standards. Instead, it was countries should enforce their own laws. And if any of you went to Guatemala like I did before CAFTA and saw what the heck was going on, where 75% of the workers were women, mostly single, making $1.25 an hour, and I looked at a product, they were women panties, so I wasn't an expert on it. But it was $5 a pack, and these people were making $1.25, a fraction, maybe 5% or less of what we were paid for in the United States. And all we asked, if you raise their wages and let them organize and not be suppressed, that package would go up 10 cents. So instead of our paying $5, we would pay $5.10. I understand the value of cheap imports. Essentially, this country, through that agreement, was being party to the conditions under which people were working. And where Mexico is different is we are dramatically competing. And I don't want to get into TPP too much, but the problem with TPP was Mexico said they would not negotiate in terms of labor standards inside of TPP.
That's not right. That's wrong.
No.
They did negotiate, and they were all in there.
Outside of TPP.
No, directly in TPP.
Okay, whatever you say.
No.
And there was
I
never,
negotiated it.
No, I was told otherwise.
No.
And they never reached an agreement. And today, within Mexico, there is still not any final action that essentially undermines an authoritarian labor market system in a democratic country. And what we're saying is we don't want to set the wages in Mexico. All we want to make sure is companies go down there. They don't go down there because of cheap labor that cannot essentially raise itself up and not displace American workers. And if you believe that American workers haven't been displaced, you should just go into the places where they have been. And companies continue to move to Mexico, not because of automation, but basically because of its cheap labor. And the question in trade agreements that we've been working on for all these years is, do you want to build standards into trade agreements? Basic international standards, whether it's labor, environment, or anything else. And those of us who have worked on this, who want expanded trade, say you're damn right. As the U.S. continues to develop trade agreements, you need to build basic international standards of many kinds into these trade agreements.
You know, Sandy, there was an article in the New York Times a few years ago about Audi making a decision of where to put its next North American factory. And they were debating between somewhere in the South, South Carolina or Georgia, and Mexico. And they ultimately decided to put it in Mexico. And when asked why they did, they said it actually has nothing to do with labor costs. Because when they take into account all sorts of other things, productivity, logistics, et cetera, that was more or less a wash. It had to do with the fact that Mexico had more free trade agreements with other countries.
Okay.
And they could use Mexico as a production platform and export those products to other places around the world. We're never going to have equal wages with Mexico, and we shouldn't be pushing our wages
sure.
down. But we shouldn't lose that battle.
Okay, two
we
things.
should be able to win the battle
two things.
of having free trade access to other countries.
Okay, just
This
two
is kind of
things.
fratricide here. This is,
Okay.
No, but just
Wipe away the word equal. That isn't what the issue is.
But just so people know where we don't disagree.
It
All of
isn't
us agree
equal.
on core labor and environmental
All of us agree with that
standards,
in the core of the agreement.
And just so
Fully
you get a
enforceable.
little sense of how the democratic and political process could work, I favored this idea back in 2001, okay? But here was my problem. I needed votes to get something done, and the Republicans who were going to provide the votes said, look, we're worried that this will get expanded and expanded, and the developing countries were worried that it would get extended. And so the people who were willing to support trade would do exactly what Sandy said, which was to say, we'll take the step of enforcing their own laws, but not further. I was glad that Sandy and other people pushed that. I think that's a good thing to do. But I could never get their votes.
That's,
And that's the problem, okay? So we can discuss this in theory, but if he would give some votes for core labor standards,
Like in Peru
then
and
we'd
Panama.
be happy.
okay, you say
Colombia.
like Peru. I'll finish. I negotiated the Peru FTA. Charlie Rangel and I negotiated
I thought I
it.
had some role in it.
Yeah, I know. You had some role, but it could not pass. The Peru agreement could not pass the way the Bush administration negotiated it. And the president of Mexico, of Peru in those days, would not step up to the plate. We took the majority in 2008. And Charlie Rangel and I went down, we negotiated some changes in the Peru Free Trade Agreement and put enforceable labor and environmental standards into the agreement. And we insisted that Peru make the changes before we voted. They did so. So forget all this notion that we won't vote for trade. We essentially worked it out. And Charlie and I went down to Peru with the president of Peru, who essentially said, this is amazing breakthrough. It's like the New Deal of Peru. We said you're going a little too far, but it's important. So that's really what this is all about. Taking labor and environmental standards and taking it away from rhetoric, taking it away from enforceability, and try to develop over time, not with equality immediately, standards upon which trade is built. And if you ask people in this country, is that what they want? Overwhelmingly, they say yes. And they say yes in part because if you don't have those kinds of standards, it's a race to the bottom, and people lose their jobs. People lose their jobs. And I'm all in favor, we'll get to TAA, I'm all in favor of helping people who lose their jobs. But we in this country who care about the democratic process with a small d, who believe in international trade, who want to expand it, have to realize that it has to be shaped so we have a way to respond to our constituents, the people of this country who lose their jobs. At least we can say we fought for standards so countries, look, Audi went to Mexico, they busted the union there, they busted the effort, they signed a contract with CTM that has 90% of these protection agreements that are thousands of them that workers never voted on. And often, as I said, were signed before there were any workers. There's only one legitimate union, from what we could tell in my last visit to Mexico, only one in the entire automotive industry, either assembly or auto parts.
So do you think ending NAFTA will build the union movement?
I'm not in favor of ending it.
Good.
I'm in favor of, people say, what's going to happen? My answer is negotiate it, but negotiate it in the right way. And build standards in and sit down with Mexico and say to Mexico, we need to sit down before, really in the next fourth round, and figure out how you're going to tear down, if you want to put it that way, your industrial policy, where workers have zero rights and they're making $2 an hour. You take my place, go any place you want, not only in the Midwest, and ask if it's fair for companies in this country and the workers who work for them to compete with conditions in Mexico where they pay $2 an hour, and they go down to Mexico.
Sandy, you know wages are based on productivity.
The minimum
and
wage.
productivity is based on investment, and it's also based on the logistics and supply system. So I would just caution you that if you try to take steps where you want to transform the world too much, and the alternative is cutting us off,
I'm not for that, Bob.
Wages. Okay,
I'm not
well,
for cutting us off.
I'm just cautioning. Some I've heard seem to go in that direction. Did you vote for Australia?
I think so. As I look back,
Would their labor standards be
Or
good enough?
Panama, or Colombia,
the answer
or
is
CPP?
The answer is I did vote for Panama. Look, we're going to bore you. I sat down.
I don't think so. I think they're getting their money's
Listen,
worth.
after the Bush administration negotiated a Panama without enforceable labor
Then we did.
standards, I went, in the Bush years, I went over to the embassy in Panama and began to renegotiate their FTA. I did it because USTR refused to do so and put labor standards and environmental standards into the Panama Free Trade Agreement. So I negotiated it, and then the
That was
speaker...
Bob's administration.
No, I did. Yeah, under his administration.
was in between,
because
right?
USTR wouldn't do it.
I don't think I was even in government then, but I'll take some blame.
I didn't say you, I said USTR.
I think it was a USTR in between the two
Okay,
of you.
you wanted a lively discussion.
So I was
So
gonna
that's
say,
the first question.
So before we open
what's
it
the
up,
second
I want
question?
to spend, and those of you who thought I was exaggerating when I said, right, U.S. trade policies being made by Harvard Law alumni, I want to spend a
God
few
forbid.
minutes.
Huh?
I want to spend a few minutes before we open this up for questions on specifically trade adjustment assistance and the types of programs that are being put forward out of Washington for those who are losing their jobs from trade. And the questions I want to ask is, to what extent is that program outdated, especially when we think about, right, a lot of these structural changes are coming from technology and automation, even just being able to separate that out. Do we need to reform it? If so, how? What types of additional programs do you think are needed? How would we pay for it in this type of environment? How have other countries been able to deal with this better, and what can we learn from them? And in what ways, besides government, do other public intellectuals, private officials need to step up and to deal with these types of challenges? And I just want to invite you to spend a few minutes on that, beyond just the trade agreements themselves and what needs to get changed. But when we think about TAA and these types of programs, what thoughts do you have?
Could I, just to set the context here, trade adjustment assistance is just one of many worker adjustment programs. But it's important to understand the congressional connectivity of this. Trade adjustment assistance is approved by the Ways and Means Committee, that's the Prime Tax and Trade Committee in the House, and the Finance Committee in the Senate, and has been since the 60s, because it was a way to help members give an explanation to say we're opening markets, but we're going to adjust. But the important thing to recognize is it's actually a rather modest-sized program, doesn't work very well in my view, of a total of about $18 billion a year that the Congress spends on adjustment. Now, the first point to be aware of is, notice I said adjustment. So a question is, should we only help people adjust if they lose their job because of trade, or any adjustment, technology and others? So these other programs, often run by the Department of Labor, and by the way, that's why through the labor committees, are for everybody, okay? So my argument would be, frankly, it doesn't matter why you lose your job. You should try to help people for whatever the cost. But it's important to know there's a political reason why these committees focus on that. Third point. The GAO did a report a few years ago, and this is a few years sort of out of date, but they asked, okay, well, how many programs do we have? It turns out we have 47 programs across 9 agencies. At that time, only 5 had been evaluated over the course of the past 5 years. Congress, and Sandy may have been part of this, I know some of my friends were actually passed something to reduce that to about 39 different set of programs. But you can see part of the nature of the problem here is we as a government have not done the types of work one should do on this. And I think you can build much greater support. But I honestly think we also have to think about it in a more expansive way. I mean, this is really not just helping people adjust. This is the educational skills level. It's a question of people kind of recognizing that maybe we may need to move from traditional degrees to certification. For those of you that read The Economist, there was a very good piece this week about the fact that even with these changes, you have a problem of geographic dispersion, where people tend to move to some of the urban areas and American labor force being less mobile. So maybe you have to do things to help with mobility. But then you have to decide, they use the example of Scranton, Pennsylvania, what happens if a lot of the mobile people leave Scranton, Pennsylvania? So these are not by any means easy issues. My own view has been the U.S. should be even bolder on this in experimenting, but do it with pilots so that we test them. So one, for example, that I've had an interest in is something called wage insurance. And the idea, it's based on the principle that if someone loses the job, best thing to do is to get them back in the private sector workforce as soon as you can. And that some of these training programs are of mixed use and quality. What wage insurance would do would be to say, let's say you're earning $50,000 a year. You can't find another $50,000 a year job. You can find a $30,000 a year job. So the difference is $20,000. So make up some percentage of that, if you want 50%, for 3 or 4 or 5 years, okay? Now, I don't know whether this will work or not, but it seems to me it's kind of worth a try, and to try to use pilots and sort of analyze these. So I think this is going to actually be, you know, if you talk to your friends, whether it's apprentice programs, whether it's community colleges, there's a host of ideas out there. But the one thing that gives me some encouragement on this is what you actually see, given the demographics in the United States, is our problem may be the lack of people to fill these jobs. And you're already seeing this in various markets because of lack of skills. And the head of AT&T was at a forum I was at, and he said, look, we're already spending about 3 cents a share, one of the biggest workforces. And he said, but this is what you have to do, Bob. He said, you have to alert the people whose jobs are going to go away in time. You have to tell them the jobs you think would be created. You have to tell them the skills they need for that. And then you have to help them with certification programs, okay? So they decided on their own that this is the direction you're going to go. So I'd like to see whether the U.S. government can help in some of these processes, because this goes back to Sandy's core point, which I'm in full agreement. Look, Mike and I can give you numbers. We can talk about how it's important to set standards for American services and intellectual property around the world. But if you're Sandy or other colleagues that have to get elected, or you have to explain to people what's happening, you need to have a better answer than we have today.
I think I agree largely with what Bob said, and I think TAA is a necessary but quite insufficient approach to the issue. It's actually quite cumbersome. It's difficult it's more difficult than it needs to be to access. We actually managed to get it expanded so that it applied to services as well as manufactured products, not just to countries with whom there were trade agreements, but anybody affected by trade. We got more money for it. We got it expanded for 6 years. So it was actually a pretty good expansion, but it's not nearly enough. And as Bob said, there's a scattering of other programs across the government. You know, I think we need to look at other countries. We're not the only country that deals with this issue, and there are lessons to be learned. Not everybody can be Singapore, but Singapore manages to say, we need 200,000 software engineers. Here, you guys are going to have training on software engineering, and here are the companies that are going to hire you, and they make that sort of happen. Australia has a Yelp-type program that rates transition programs and training programs so that workers know what's working and what's not working. South Korea has very proactive adjustment policies. In the Nordic countries, the unions actually play a significant role in thinking about the retraining of their own members for new jobs. So I think we could learn from a lot of other countries. We could do pilots at the state level and local level and see what works. It does have this political import that it makes it easier for people to vote for trade bills or trade agreements if they can also be voting for trade adjustment assistance at the same time. But while our friends at the AFL-CIO will tell us you absolutely need to have it, and we hate it. We call it funeral insurance, and we don't like it, and we don't like the fact that it has to be used, but we'll hold it against you if you don't roll it over. And I think we need to be much more creative, particularly when we think about what's coming down the road on technology and the vastly greater number of jobs that could be put at risk because of artificial intelligence and the rest. If we just think back to this last election and see the degree of anger and resentment we saw at a time when we had 15.5 million new jobs, 4.5% unemployment, 2.5% wage growth for 2 or 3 years. Now imagine a time where even if these estimates of the impact of artificial intelligence are only half right, but some significant portion of our jobs, our people are feeling at risk, that's a very serious political and social issue that we have to get our arms around.
Just briefly, because it's your turn next. By the way, there are other issues in NAFTA besides this basic issue that I think is primary as to the basis standards for competition. And like the administration's proposal on sunsetting and rules of origin. But let me just say a word. I'm in full agreement. We have a program that's totally inadequate when there's labor displacement. We spend 1/10 as much as some European countries do. We need to do much better. I just want to be sure we don't use it as a reason not to also straighten out trade policy. We need to try to have a trade policy that addresses what I think is a strong feeling in our country, the reality of wage stagnation for 30 years. And as was said by Bob, and I think you agree, there were other factors in the 2016 election besides the wage stagnation. But I think all of us who haven't had wage stagnation, that includes most of us in public office and a lot of people in the higher income brackets, we just have to realize what's happened in this country in terms of wage inequality. It is historically wrong, and I think is really evil. And it isn't the sole source of the consternation in this country. But if we don't address it, including in trade agreements, as well as how we help people who are displaced, I think we're going to give more and more room the people who are much better than tearing down some walls while they want to build others. I guess you get my message. It's your turn, right?
So let me add one last note to the Congressman's point there. We showed you that chart to start this saying 80% of this country, right, is facing some form of flat wages or declining wages, right? That comparable figure for the decade prior was 2%, just to give you a sense of how large that shift is. Now, as we've discussed, there are structural forces, right? The leadership matters here and so forth, but this is the challenge of our era in terms of dealing with these domestic consequences.